And that leads us to today's topic, how to best protect those legacy properties. So if you're attending today's webinar live, there is a question and answer feature available. So if you have any questions as I talk about our topic today, please just type those in those Q&A features. I'd be more than happy to answer your questions. You don't have to wait for the end, just type something in if you have a question. If you're watching a recording of today's webinar, that's a benefit of registering and attending these webinars live, is you have the opportunity to ask questions. But here at Hooper Law Office, we are an estate planning and elder law firm. So really within those things, we focus on, wills and trusts, but also planning for family businesses, legacy properties. So if you have any questions about that, do know that we offer a 2-hour complimentary initial consultation where you can meet with an attorney from our offices. We have offices here in Appleton, Green Bay, Oshkosh. Happy to meet with you wherever it works best. Those 2 hours just give us a chance to get to know you, your family, your goals, and can make a recommendation for what will be a good fit. Quote any fees at that time, but again, that initial consult is completely complimentary. We're sending out a material today, a link to a feedback form for any comments that you have on today's webinar. I'd love to know your comments, constructive or otherwise, if you're willing to share them. And on that same link, you will have the opportunity to register for that initial consultation if you want us to give you a call to schedule. So happy to do that. Otherwise, you'll also receive your tools for protecting up north properties handout, which we'll walk through today. What's really important with up north properties, or I guess real estate in general, are deeds. So you might be familiar with deeds. They're just the document that demonstrate who owns the property. Properties can be owned by an individual, group of individuals, trusts, LLCs, all good things that we'll talk about. It's more about deciding what type of ownership is best for you. But know that how you can find out who owns the property is by looking at that deed. Deed shows you current ownership. Deeds can also be used as ways to transfer property without probate. There's time of death deeds and other things, but you want to keep in mind not only who currently owns it, but what the plan is for when that owner or owners pass away. That's all found on your deed, as well as any restrictions on transfers, those important things. A couple of options outside of just having a, classic owner or co-owners written directly on that deed are partnerships. So sometimes partnerships can own property such as hunting lands, family cabins, that sort of thing. And what a partnership really is it's a written document. It's with 2 or more people, and they just agree to certain rules and processes with regard to co-owning that business or co-owning that property. So there may be a partnership established as the owner on certain lands. We want to keep in mind who those parties are, what they're agreeing to. But largely when we're looking at hunting land and, other legacy properties such as cottages, we're talking more about liability with those things. And oftentimes not only creating your rule book, having that plan for what happens when you pass away, but also making sure that you're protected from the liabilities that those properties could create. Because with hunting land or cottages, you may not always be directly in control of who is there and what could happen on those properties. An LLC or a limited liability company can be created to help, kind of insulate that liability for whatever might happen on that property. So it's still a written agreement walking through the ownership, the members, the managers, all those good things. But it helps to limit any liability for creditors to the assets of that LLC. So yes, if something happens at that hunting land, something happens at that family cabin or cottage, that could impact that family cabin or cottage, but at least it's not impacting you as a person, your home, your retirement, other things like that. So that LLC can also focus on the rules and restrictions, transfers of that LLC shares or among owners. So again, it's really important not only how property is going to pass, but the rules associated with that. The LLC then also helps to limit liabilities by having that created in an LLC. it becomes more important then to know that with LLCs, there's changes in the laws. So Wisconsin has new LLC laws, and it's much more important to make sure that you have an operating agreement. So if you have an existing LLC, but you don't have an operating agreement, that's something to consider. And certainly something we could also review if you have one in place. And just know that with that new law too, single member LLCs now have decreased creditor protection. So there are some changes there. So if you're a single member LLC, all the much more important to have that operating agreement and understand how that law has changed. And with LLCs too, as wonderful as they are for creating that rule book, saying, you know, this is how we pay taxes, this is how we handle maintenance and utilities and general upkeep, this is, you know, when people can come and use the property. As fundamentally important as those things are, as important as creating that liability protection, because you can't always control who's up there and accessing, it is important to know, though, that LLCs alone are not protecting that property from long-term care expenses. So oftentimes I meet with clients who have this legacy property, and it's a priority to pass this on to the next generation. And one of the things that could disrupt that legacy is long-term care expenses. So while LLCs are wonderful to have, just know that for long-term care expenses, that's not necessarily protecting it from those other liabilities that can happen with care needs. If you are worried about care needs too, what you might be looking at is not only having an LLC in place, but having a trust in place. So there are, you know, many different types of trusts. They're not all the same. They're specifically drafted around your concerns. A benefit of trusts in general are in the fact that it's a non-probate transfer of property then when you pass away. So sometimes, regardless of care needs, trust can be a great fit for making sure that that property is passed down to the people you want it to without needing to go through the probate process. But some trusts can be drafted to create not only, you know, additional creditor protection, but to help around long-term care costs. So you can have the LLC that creates that good rule book and liability protection, but you can also have that trust that works in conjunction with that LLC to keep that specific asset or that portion of that asset away from those long-term care expenses. So they really work hand in hand. If that's the concern, if long-term care and liability is the concern, they work together. You do want to have both if that's the concern, but LLCs, again, fundamentally getting that rule book, having that liability protection, and just be aware of those changes. You'll want to have good things like operating agreements. I'm going to continue, but I'm just going to remind that if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them as we go through. I probably covered a lot very fast. That's what we do with the webinars. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, talking about ownership in general, it's important to understand that how this property is owned has implications, because whatever happens to the owner of a property happens to that property. So if someone is getting sued or divorced, or they have long-term care needs, all those things can impact these properties depending on how they're owned. You can help insulate with trust, with LLCs, but ultimately whatever happens to that owner happens to that property. And outside of the current owners and how they manage things together and how they work together, there's the idea of passing ownership on to other people. Multiple owners just means more liabilities, more things that you need to be aware of. If you have, cabin with 100 owners, well, that just means you have more potential liabilities and more potential conflict. And that number sounds crazy. It's a real world example, because I mean, if you think about if you and your spouse own a cabin or a hunting land and you leave that to your 4 kids, even if those 4 kids can manage it pretty well together at some point, if they're looking to pass it on, maybe those 4 kids have 4 kids. And now look at how many owners you have of a property, how many liabilities you have, how many conflicts you have. Legacy property can be wonderful for keeping a family together. It can also be one of the reasons that a family breaks apart. So having that rule book in the LLC, but also having that additional care protection can be really helpful. That extends to how you make sure someone inherits as well. So again, multiple owners, not only more liability, but more conflict, because if you have that cabin with 100 owners, well, how's the property getting maintained? Who's up there using the property? How's maintenance handled? How are taxes handled? All these things might be easy to decide between you and a friend or you and a sibling, but are you going to be able to decide that between cousins, second cousins, people who really don't know each other that well? That starts to become the problem, and where you can ultimately lose property to not just care, not just lawsuits, but to that kind of infighting when you have that many owners and that many potential sources of conflict. So it's also important to say, how is the next generation going to manage the shared ownership? How is this going to work for them? And if that is an important piece of the legacy that you're leaving, know that you can create a way to create like more funding of that. So set aside specific money to be used to help maintain that hunting land or cabin or cottage. Treat it almost like that pseudo fourth or fifth child in that fourth child example. You have the ability to help, cover those costs if you're concerned about, well, I want to leave it to my 3 kids, but one of them can't afford it. You have solutions if you are able to undergo that planning, and that's something we can help with. We'd love to help you with that. A lot of this too starts to feel like it depends on your concerns, on the people you're trying to have manage, but having that plan in place is how you can kind of create those answers. Understanding that there have been some changes in LLC laws, very important to have an operating agreement. I have that plan not only for now, not only for care, but into the future. So I didn't have too much else that I really wanted to touch on today. I guess I got through that faster than I thought. Are there any questions? Anyone has any questions on what I've said? You will again get that handout running through a lot of these same points. So hopefully that helps understanding the options and tools that you have. Well, without seeing any more questions, I guess I'll just cut it short for today. Thank you for attending the webinar. And again, you're going to receive those feedback forums on today's presentation, the materials about the tools that you have to protect up north properties. And then just know that next week we're going to be back with another webinar. It's all about protecting your legacy, estate planning 101. So good fundamentals of estate planning. The week after that, we're actually going to be doing our wills versus trust seminar event. Talking about, again, core estate planning things, wills, trusts, what they do, how they work. We're going to be at the Neville Public Museum for that. And you can always go to estateplanninglive.com to see our full list of upcoming events and register for any of them if you'd like to. If you want to attend that seminar, make sure you register. You receive a book there too. And I do just see a question. It says, what about in-laws and how should they or shouldn't they be included? So there's not a right or wrong way to include in-laws or not include them. You just want to make sure that when we're talking about liabilities such as divorce, that if your plan is to not include those in-laws, to make sure that it stays within your family meaning your kids, your grandkids, that you define that with ownership restrictions, making sure that it has to be someone who's related to you, who's a member. So that way you have protections in cases of divorce. And if that's something where you actually really wanted to make sure to include that in-law, then you don't have those restrictions. You leave that kind of more up to your kids and how they would like to pass their interest. So how you include or exclude in-laws is based on the restrictions that you have and what you would like to do with the property. Just know that you can put those in place and have some additional protections. So that way it's not taken away in certain things like divorce or other issues there too. So I hope that answers the question. And again, if you have any other questions, otherwise I think we're all set for today. Did you go over protecting for long-term care purposes? Yes. So if you missed that part, we talked about how to protect legacy property such as cabins and hunting land from long-term care purposes, and just identifying that LLCs do not protect against long-term care expenses. What protects against long-term care expenses is doing a type of trust, often called an irrevocable trust or other planning, that says that even though you would own it or be a part of it, you'd actually have the trust own it. So that way that trust isn't available for your long-term care expenses, both in terms of overall eligibility and also to protect it from things like estate recovery, which is not something that we talked about too much in this session. Just know that estate recovery is something where potentially if someone accesses a benefit like Medicaid, they can come back after certain assets that person had. If you have that members, if you're using the LLC example, if you have that member's interest protected within a trust that protects it from long-term care, that's how they work hand in hand to be better able to protect not only against liabilities, but to protect against that current owner's long-term care liabilities. So I hope that makes sense. We talked about that more towards the beginning, but again, these are great questions. Okay, I see. How about using joint tenancy with parents and kids? So what that's referring to is, again, is it really matters who owns a property. So if you were to own a legacy property, you and your spouse with your kids, that would mean that you're all current owners. So again, whatever happens to an owner of a property happens to that property. So a better thing in terms of creating that liability protection for everyone is to have that LLC in place, have that LLC own the property, and then have, parents, kids, whoever you want to be current members as members of that LLC. It can help to create some of those additional protections. And you want to be aware of too is not only how you currently own something, but what happens when those people who are current owners pass away. So it matters with joint tenancy just to know that when an owner passes away, say you have two owners and they're joint tenants, that just becomes that one owner's property. There's other things like tenants in common, where then that half would go down according to that person's estate plan. So that joint tenancy kind of slowly restricts who owns it, which could mean that if you have multiple children and your plan was to pass, if one of the children passed away, pass it down to their kids, that's not going to happen with joint tenancy because you're just kind of slowly restricting down the ownership unless you get it updated with something different, such as a trust. How does equipment like snowmobiles or boats work? Should those be owned by the LLC? How does that impact liability if there was an accident or injury? So your LLC can own, physical items that are on the property. So such as if you had a title of a boat, again, kind of helps to protect for if that boat got in an accident, UTVs, I've seen stuff like that. The way the LLC works is if that item actually has a title. Some items don't actually have titles like the way a car or boat would, but you can certainly have that. And that's another really good reason why you want to have an LLC if you have, say, a cabin where you go out boating a lot. Boating accidents do happen. You can be involved in a boating accident, and you can include that in with items that are titled. I see a question, would joint tenancy or tenancy in common protect for long-term care planning purposes? It doesn't. So those differences between joint tenancy and tenancy in common is just what happens when someone passes away. It doesn't create any protection for long-term care, like availability or recovery, because again, that person is still the owner. If care is the concern, that's where you want to start thinking about more like doing a trust, maybe again, a trust in coordination with an LLC. That's a good question though. Joint tenancy in common is just like a, there's a technical name for it. There's a technical name, vested interest, determines how that interest is vested. Doesn't make a difference in terms of who the actual owner is, only what happens when they pass away. So these are, are there any other questions? Thank you guys for asking questions at the end. I felt bad running a little short, but I felt like I covered everything. Okay. I'll give it a second for other questions, but I just want to remind that next week we're having a webinar again. Next week's topic will actually be about protecting your legacy. So good estate planning 101 fundamentals, talking about, options that you have there. And if you're curious on like wills and trusts and the other things that you have, we are actually having, again, that wills versus trust seminar the week after, so that third week in November in Green Bay at the Neville Public Museum. You can go on to estateplanninglive.com to see our full schedule of events, register for any of those. If you want to attend that wills versus trust seminar, I would definitely suggest that you register. That way, we'll give out some books and materials and talk more about wills and trusts. But if I was to start to talk about those things in more detail today, I'd keep you well past any amount of time you expected to allocate. So attend that seminar if you have those great questions. Just again, understand this is the purpose of LLCs. This is the importance of ownership related to these properties. And you have other planning options, and we're certainly happy to help. So otherwise, thank you guys so much for your time today. Hope to see you at other webinars and events, and happy